Hey, welcome to another quick video, Lessons on Learning, where we are just going to produce some short, quick-fire videos that is going to help us understand how people learn, how our learners learn, and how we can get our information across more effectively, more dynamically, more engaging. Hopefully to create a better learning experience for our learners and I hope as well, a better teaching experience for us. So let's dive in to this one. So I'm always having arguments, debates really, with other educators about the difference between information and knowledge. And, I think there's a big difference between information and knowledge. Information is stuff that's being flooded into us all the time. We're absorbing it all the time, but it's quite transient. It's quite passive. It comes in and it goes back out again. Through experience, adoption, implementation, we can usually turn that information into knowledge, and it's knowledge that is a little bit more permanent, and it's knowledge that really makes a difference. Knowledge is the successful implementation of the information in order to solve problems or create better outcomes or to live more successfully, and knowledge usually comes through some kind of experience. So that's the argument that we have, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the barriers to learning, and certainly how information can create barriers to learning. Now, there are lots of things, lots of situations that can create a barrier to learning, but types of information can certainly create a barrier to learning, and that's what we're going to explore today. I'm going to use an iPad so that we can get a bit more of this information. Let me just adjust this iPad and set it up properly so that it's easy for us to read. And so what we're going to look at is we're going to look at this thing called information here. That's not very good. Let's type that. Let's try that one again. There you go. That's a little bit better. This thing called information here. So this is the information. And we're going to look at different types of information, or how information is presented that can create this barrier to learning. And the first barrier to learning really simply is a lack of information. So if we're missing out steps or we're missing out vital pieces of information, that can be a real barrier to learning. Well, I know that sounds really obvious, like, yeah, of course, Chris, if you don't give them the information, they won't learn. But what I want you to think about is I want you to think about how often we share information, how often we talk to somebody about something, and we miss out really vital steps for two reasons. Reason number one, we assume that it's too simple and so everybody would know. So of course you know that, so I'm not going to bother telling you that. And it could be something as simple as I don't know, sending a text on a phone, and we assume that everybody knows where the text button is, or to tap it, or we assume that people know how to open up the text client, and so we make assumptions that people already know things because we feel that it's too simple to teach, or they should already know that. So we miss out information. A lack of information can be a real barrier to learning. The other reason is that we're operating from such an advanced level ourselves. Usually whatever it is that we're teaching, we're usually quite good at it. That's why we're teaching. And because we're quite good at it, it means that we often do things on autopilot. And what we do is we often combine 2 or 3 complex steps together and make that into one quick, simple step. Think about tying your shoelaces, for instance, and how quickly you do things almost without thinking about it. So often when we're teaching, if we're not careful, we can be operating from a place of autopilot, and that can be really dangerous because we're often showing or demonstrating things that involve lots of complex movements, but we're not necessarily sharing all the steps in that movement because we're doing it from a place of autopilot. Does that make sense? You can usually tell, actually, you can hear a trainer when they'll say things like, do it like this, or just like that, or then it's as simple as this. And when they're not breaking it down into steps. That's a whole other thing. Maybe if you get to join me on one of my in-person educator training days, or if you get to work with me and my partner, Chris Barron, you'll hear us talking about steps and stages and how we can use those to really make sure that information is succinct but complete. So the first barrier to learning, a lack of information. Again, I know that sounds really oversimplified, but there it is. You see, if I hadn't have put that in there, if I hadn't have said a lack of information, then You wouldn't have known it. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get that information to sit better in the triangle, but never mind. You get the idea. So first barrier to learning, a lack of information. So what's the second barrier to information? Well, let's get this pen running. It's a misunderstanding. So I'm just going to put misunderstood information. So when it's information that is misunderstood, and that could be a misunderstood word or a misunderstood phrase or a misunderstood sentence. Now that could be one of two things. Maybe people assume that it means something else, or they think it means something else when in actual fact it doesn't. It means what you mean it to mean, not what they think it means. So there's a misunderstanding about what that actually means. For instance, like in teaching, for instance, we talk about learning curve, and learning curve is a misunderstood thing. People think that learning curve means that if it's a steep learning curve, it means it's really, really difficult, when in actual fact what that means is if it's a steep learning curve, it means that there's a lot of information to share. There's a lot of information can be gained in a short period of time. So a misunderstood word or a misunderstood phrase, or it could be just something that people just don't understand. Maybe it's a word that they don't understand, a word that's not commonly used, or maybe they're operating in a second language. Perhaps the language that you're teaching in is not the first language that they learned, and so they're operating in a second language. So it could be they misunderstand what a word or a phrase means, and they get not quite the right meaning, or they simply don't know what it means at all. Now, whatever the case is, when this happens, when there is a misunderstanding of information, all further learning stops until that misunderstanding is cleared up. I want you to think about the last time you were reading a book, or maybe listening to a talk, or looking at some diagrams or something, whatever it is, however you were taking that information, and there was a word or a phrase or a diagram that you didn't understand. And I'll guarantee from that point on, you had to go and find out what that meant before you went further forward. So you're reading a book, for instance, you come across a word that you've never heard before, you don't know what the word means, and it just drives you nuts. And all you can think about is that word and what that word means. So you run off to grab a dictionary, or you probably Google it. What does the word mean? You read its context. Now it makes sense, and now learning can continue. So it's worth checking all the time. One of my faults that I often get picked up on is I have a filler word. Lots of us have filler words, and one of my filler words is, well, it's a phrase, is does that make sense? And I probably use it too much, actually. But if used inappropriately, does that make sense? Does that make sense? It can sound a little condescending, a little patronizing. But in this case, it really does matter. If you say something that you feel might be difficult to understand, or is commonly misunderstood, or maybe has 2 or 3 different meanings out there, it's worth pausing and saying, does that make sense? Do you understand that piece of information? So, and if you're using words, just go for the simplest word. I know it sounds great when you use very kind of complex or convoluted words, but if it's not necessary, don't. Our job as teachers is to simplify things. We don't necessarily have to make things simple, but we do have to simplify things. So what word, what phrase can you use that can be simplified, that's easy to understand? Because a big barrier to learning is a misunderstood word or a misunderstood phrase, a misunderstanding of information. Okay, so that brings us, what's our third and final barrier to learning? Well, our third and final barrier is an opposite. Rather than being too little information, it's when there's actually too much, or an overload, however you want to call it, too much information. And so it's when we overload our learners with more information than they're capable of processing in the time that we have. And so again, think about it from us as a teacher's point of view. We are probably sharing information that we know really, really well. And what we've done is we've taken all of this learning, all of this knowledge that we've assimilated over many months, often many years, and we're trying to share it with everybody because we think it's all important. And instead of leaving anything out, we think, oh no, I've got to share this, I've got to share this, there's a little bit more here. And we do the opposite. We kind of overcomplex things, if you like. I often have a phrase, and you might have seen it before, and the phrase is this, and write this down because it's an important phrase: stop trying to squeeze years of learning into hours of teaching. That means it might have taken you years to learn this, and what you're trying to do is squeeze it all into your learner in a matter of hours. And I mean, essentially, a good part of teaching is that you can simplify things so that you can accelerate things, but there's a limit as to how much you can accelerate. You're not going to accelerate 12 months of hair color chemistry into just 1 hour. There's just too much data, too much information. So in other words, what that means is too much information. We just need to cut back on the information. So rather than condensing it, which means just talking quicker and getting as much out as you possibly can, what can I edit out during this class? What can I edit out and what can I save for later? So be really mindful of how much information you're sharing and how much our learners are capable of absorbing and processing. Now, when I say about a learner's capability, that's got nothing to do with abilities or intelligence, nothing at all. All of us can absorb information for a certain amount of time, at which point we then need to break off, we need to reflect, process on that information, and possibly, if we can, even implement that information. Remember, the difference between information and knowledge is information implemented and reflected upon and adopted and adapted, that kind of thing. So we have to be careful how much information we're giving and that we're not giving any kind of information overload. There is a slight addition to this as well. There is a slight addition to this. So this thing about having too much information, it can also mean that we have too steep a gradient. And so I'm going to just put that here in green as well, in brackets. I'm going to put gradient here as well. So it's too steep a gradient. So what do we mean by that? It just means that we're asking our learners to do too much in the time that we have allocated. That makes sense? Did it again, but I'm serious. Did that make sense? We're asking them to get to too high a level in the time that we have available. So let's imagine that we have, and you may have seen me do something like this before, this is kind of like the skill level. This is how skilled this is, and this is the time, how much time we have. And what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to get our learners, all the way up here, in this amount of time, when it's just too steep a gradient. The time that we have, our learners will probably do this because, the gradient needs to be more gentle. Does that make sense? Like that kind of thing. So what we're asking them to do is too much, too challenging. There's too much information, too much practice, too much experience to squeeze into the time that we have. It's a little bit like, I suppose, I don't know, I'm going to be really extreme here. Learn to be a jet fighter pilot in less than a day, or learn to do brain surgery in less than a day. It's got nothing to do with ability or talent. You may well be a jet fighter pilot or a brain surgeon one day, but you won't be that in one day, if that makes sense. You may get there one day, but it won't be in one day. So too steep a gradient, too much information, too short a space of time. So that's what we're looking at, the 3 barriers to learning. And there are more barriers, but that when it comes to giving information, when we're giving information, which we so often are when we're teaching, that's what we have to be careful of. That there is enough information, that it's not too little, that we're not missing out steps because we're on autopilot, or we're assuming that nobody needs to know that, or we're assuming that everybody already knows that. So too little information. Misunderstood information. We're missing the meaning, or our learners don't know what we mean, or they don't know what the word means, or they misunderstand the phrase or the sentence. So a misunderstanding of information. And last but not least, thirdly, too much information, too steep a gradient, too much to absorb, too much to process in the time that we have. Those 3 things will be a real barrier, and they will really impede learning. So be aware of them, and once you're aware of them, you can change them and you can control them. Look, I hope that's been useful. If it has, make sure that you hit the like button, subscribe, drop me a comment on what you think about the content and what about the information, or maybe even tag a friend and see if they enjoy it as well. All right, I'll see you on the next one. Take care, my friend. Bye-bye.